So, welcome to another webinar here as part of the series. My name is Joel Beckerman from Your Music, Your Future. We have an incredible guest here today, Todd Brabec, who is not only an incredible expert in the law around music, but also an expert witness in testimony, but really an expert in how composers get paid. And just to tell you a little bit more about him, Todd Brabec is a former ASCAP Executive Vice President and Worldwide Director of Membership. He is an entertainment law attorney and industry consultant, a Deems Taylor Award-winning co-author of the best-selling music business book, Music, Money, and Success, The Insider's Guide to Making Money in the Music Business. It is the Bible in the industry. If you haven't read it yet, as a composer, there's so much to learn and also so much for people in other parts of the music business, whether you're an agent or a manager or a publisher. Anyone in the music business, this is really, again, the Bible for this kind of work that we do. Todd, if you don't mind, let's just talk a little bit about the nature of performance royalties for folks who have not been through this before. Everyone knows that there are upfront fees that composers get for the work that they do, for the actual composing work. And then there are performance royalties, and then there's a number of other sources of income. But maybe you can speak a little bit about these sources of income for new composers, and maybe even a refresher for some people who have been around for a while.
Oh, yeah, sure, Joel. It's like when I think of performance royalties, I mean, it includes practically every type of music when it's performed anywhere in the world. So I'm simplifying here, but that's basically it. When it's not, except in the home, anytime you hear music being performed, a license needs to be taken out, permission granted, and hopefully compensation paid to the creator and normally the music publisher in these situations. And performances, to me, is really how composers make money, how to make a living in this business. It's because of performances, because you've got most composers, you have an initial fee. It could be low, it could be high, depending on what your stature is. Many of the deals are package deals, so you're hopefully breaking even, maybe making a profit. But you need the back end is how you make a living in this business. And that's really subsequent performances on all types of media, primarily the broadcast and cable area, and now the audio-visual streaming area. So performances are how you make money. It's basically writers and publishers join organizations. In the United States, you have 4 of them: ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR. These organizations negotiate fees, license fees, with the users of music. Could be NBC network, it could be Spotify, it could be Amazon Prime, whomever, wherever music is being performed. They then collect the fees, and then they distribute it back to the writers and publishers based on a 50-50 split. And that's not only in the United States, but throughout the entire world. You have a performing rights organization. In England, it's the PRS for Music. France, it's SACEM. APRA in Australia, SOCAN in Canada, GEMA in Germany. So every country of the world has this system which it really creates the main source of royalty income for composers and theme writers and songwriters.
Got it. And Todd, if you can speak a little bit about, so I could just talk about as a composer myself. I know that I invest money in gear every year, in space, in music editors. There's a whole variety of different ways that I have to invest in my own career and in the work that I do. And pretty much everyone is in the same position. So when you talk about breaking even, I imagine that's part of what you're talking about. Can you, so for those who may be new, sometimes there are people who are songwriters who are also composers. Can you discuss sort of the difference between owning your own publishing as a songwriter or a piece of publishing, in addition to writer share, and work for hire for composers, just for those folks who do both?
Yeah, basically, when a writer, a composer, a songwriter, whomever, any creator, when they create something, they in effect have created a copyright, and so they are initially the owner of that copyright. Now, in a regular type of, putting aside the film and TV area and video game area, For regular songwriters, normally they own the copyright. They will make a deal with a music publisher, normally assign the copyright to a music publisher, either 100% or have a co-publishing deal 50-50. And and the publisher handles all the business for that particular composer, all the collections, all the licensing and everything else. And then in those situations, there's under the copyright law, a writer can actually recapture the US rights after 35 years or 56 years, depending on when it was created. I won't get into the legal points of this whole thing, just be aware of it. For most film, television, video game composers, they sign what is called a work for hire agreement. And all that means is that the studio or the production company or whomever they sign with, owns that copyright 100% for the entire term of that copyright, and which is normally 95 years from publication of a work or 120 years from creation. So it's an extended period of time, but the writer doesn't have any recapture right. As part of the work for hire agreements, there's almost normally a Schedule A or a schedule of royalties. It's almost like a songwriter royalty sheet. And it gives the composer 50% of all, 50% of all performance monies, ASCAP, BMI, whomever, any type of other type of use. There's a set royalty structure for that composer. Could be have a song and a score and a greeting card, as simple as that, or in a video game, or subsequent uses. It spells out all the royalties that a composer will get. Without that Schedule A or royalty agreement, it's a complete buyout and there are no back-end royalties. So that's one thing you have to be careful in the work for hire agreement. You always want a Schedule A royalty sheet, which is standard in the industry.
Well, let's just talk about that for a second, because it's important to note that composers have a choice in terms of how they get compensated. They can get compensated under a buyout basis, as you're saying. It's sort of a one-time payment. You walk away from it, you never see any money from it again, even if it's a hit. There is direct licensing, which we'll talk about in a second, and then there's working through the PRO system and collecting back-end royalties. Look, if you think you can do a better deal and make more money licensing your own music, that's always an option. Can you talk about people licensing their music in terms of maybe music libraries or other kinds of situations?
Yeah, you have a lot of different scenarios when you're talking about buyouts, direct licenses, or source licenses, or the PROs. One thing to keep in mind, if you are a member of ASCAP or BMI or CSAC, the three U.S. organizations, under their contracts and their deals with the government, it's a non-exclusive license. So you actually have the right to license outside of those organizations. That's an important point that everybody needs to know. So you do have a choice on it. But when you're looking at a user, let's say a production company who wants to do a buyout or a direct license or a source license, just a direct license is a license between a composer who owns the copyright or a publisher and a broadcaster, where it bypasses the PRO system completely, the ASCAP BMI system. A source license is when let's say a production company or a studio comes to a composer and asks them for a direct license, which would also bypass the performing rights organization. It's a one-time fee. For anybody signing those type of deals, the most important thing is to know what the PRO system, performing rights organization system, produces in back-end royalties. And anybody, I'm always concerned if anybody signs a complete buyout. To me, that's an absolute disaster. I mean, maybe you may be forced into it, or maybe forced, maybe the user may want you to do it and stuff. But to me, having no back-end royalties is really, you cannot make a living as a composer these days with that type of scenario and stuff. And I always look back and I think, I moved out to LA in 1978 and got back and heavily involved with the film and TV composers during that period, and most of them I still see. And the writers of all those series in the 70s and 80s and 90s, they're still making money from performances of those series throughout the entire world. So that's the back-end royalty that I'm talking about. And if you are doing a buyout, you should at least know the type of things you should be asking for. I'll give you a couple examples which, if you're taking a buyout, you try to at least have something based on any type of subsequent performances of that episode or film and stuff. you get the prevailing, whatever the prevailing rates that you were getting paid at ASCAP or BMI, or the try to figure out what the market value of rights is over time. What's the industry custom and practice in this type of thing? You have to have an awful lot of knowledge to actually do a buyout, because you have to understand what you're losing. And in most cases, at least a lot of the direct licenses that I've seen, many of them do have some kind of limited back end. But again, on the other hand, many of them don't. So it's something to really be concerned about. But you do have a choice. Even if you're a member of ASCAP or BMI, you do.
And just to your point, now let's move into sort of where we are right now, which is the streaming services. I think some people are more familiar with how broadcast television works and how cable works and local television. But here we are in this streaming world where you may work on a series and it shows across the globe. And a lot of people are questioning, well, how much money do I make, or can I make a living working on streaming shows? And maybe you can speak just a little bit about that, and then we can sort of connect a little, connect the dots actually to some dollars. But can you talk about how streaming royalties work now in connection with, or when you compare it against network or cable?
Well, currently, because it really goes back to the amount of money that comes into the performing rights organizations. And as I said, in the U.S., starting point is it's about $3.1 billion comes into ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and GMR. ASCAP and BMI are, by far the biggest. I think they're $1.3 billion each. And how that's broken up, you look at each individual area that comes in, because that's how you really, the starting point of how a composer gets paid in this area. Broadcast TV is probably about $225 million. Cable TV totals about $625 million comes into these organizations. You've got foreign coming in from foreign countries when performances of episodes and series and films are being shown outside the U.S. It's about $775 million comes into the U.S. For U.S. composers primarily. And then you've got the online world, which is up to about the digital online world for audio streaming and audio visual streaming is now close to $1 billion that comes in. It's actually become the largest source of revenue for the U.S. PROs. And this is not the exception either. Many of the countries in the world, there's been significant increases in the digital area. So it's positive as to the money coming in, because it's significantly, I'll give you a quick example. Back in 2011, when Amazon and Netflix really started becoming popular, about $55 million came into the U.S. PROs for all streaming services, audio and audio visual. By 2015, it was $125 million came in total. Now, close to $1 billion that comes in. So you can see the significant growth of this area. You have to factor in, though, one thing, because the growth in income has been great, which is continuing, fortunately. But the amount of performances in the online digital world are in the trillions. So if you look at what's being processed by the 4 U.S. performing rights organizations, it's probably about 5 trillion with a T performances. About 95% of those are online digital performances. So with about 5% going to traditional
media. That is a lot of binging. That is a lot of binge watching.
It is, but it also translates into the value of each particular view. So, if you have a huge amount of performances and an increased amount of money each year, but when you start making the division, just take a simple example. Say you have 3 trillion performances and you have $1 billion. I don't even have a calculator that's going to make that division, but to give you the per performance rate, per view rate. So you do need an awful lot of performances when you do have anything in the audio or audiovisual streaming area to actually start making money.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because you and I have had this conversation in the past, Todd, but, when you're looking at a broadcast or a cable program, in general, they're looking at things like ratings, but there may over time, actually, if you add it all up, do you think that there's a similar number of people / performances on cable and network, or is it When you look at each individual person watching a cable or network show and adding it up in aggregate, is it similar? Is it more? Is it less?
It's going to vary, but you can make some analogies because there's no other analogy you can make. You have a Nielsen rating, which I can't remember what a point is. Let's say it's 2 million viewers or 5 million or whatever the figure is these days, because it changes and stuff. And you can go to a very successful audiovisual streaming service, whether it's on Netflix or Amazon. Those are two of the primary ones, obviously, where the money is better than some of the others. HBO Max is good also. And you just look at the numbers, and you're looking at if you look at any of these statements, if you're seeing something that has 100,000 views versus a million views, you want to be the million view person, and then there are multiples on top of that. So, and it really depends on the number of people who are going to view your particular creation, whether it's a series or whether it's a we've done charts on it, which I think you'll be doing shortly, as to just showing people what things are worth. But it's a different kind of mentality. You have to remember that you could have a series that absolutely no one watches in the world, and obviously you would get zero. And that same series on network or cable TV would be generating income, because there are some bottom line figures in those medium, in traditional media. Mm-hmm. So it's just a different way of looking at things, but the basic formulas of how composers get paid are pretty much the same. It's a type of use, a background score versus theme songs versus visual vocals versus logos and promos. Those are all paid differently by each of the PROs based on, when you compare the others. License fee of the station is very important. So whatever has been negotiated, the audience measurement is a big one in traditional media, and it's the same thing in the audio-visual streaming services. Time of day is a factor with some PROs. Duration of the use, in a lot of cases, determines value also. So, and there's a whole bonus structure also in the U.S. PROs, where frequently performed shows or get additional monies, because that drives the license fees of that particular station. Right. So,
and to your point,
we can get into it if you want, but I'm just mentioning it. It's a factor that does affect payments.
So let's compare, if you don't mind, and I know it's difficult to kind of do complete apples to apples. Are streaming shows earning, if you have a successful streaming show, is it earning similar money to what a cable show would be or a network show? Is it a lot less? Is it a lot more? Sort of the state of the art right now. As you said, it's changing over time, but in terms of where we are right now.
Yeah, where we are right now, I'll throw it out and say it's encouraging the direction is going. When this, 5 years ago, we have the same conversation, and the streaming shows, no matter how popular they were, let alone if you're not popular, or a feature film on it, did not generate much money. Very low, exceptionally low versus what you would make from, let's say, a HBO or a TNT or an ABC or CBS or NBC network. No comparison whatsoever, no matter how many views you have. It's gotten better because the license fees from the audiovisual streaming services have been negotiated to a greater extent with significantly greater numbers than they were before. So you're starting to see, particularly, I know ASCAP recently put a bonus structure in for audiovisual streaming services, the main services and stuff. And it's still new, but the reaction I've gotten, and I think you've gotten it also, Joel, from composers who have seen it, is very positive, where the figures are starting to look comparable to cable and possibly even a network based on the viewership and stuff like that.
Yeah.
For most programming, though, we're still at a very, very low per view number, and you do need significant numbers. I would like to say 1 million at least to start making decent money in this particular area.
Yeah. So let's talk about that, because I know that, and you're one of the people who've actually set this in play years ago in the PRO system, but there's a percentage of revenue, right, from each of these different licensees that goes to composers. And maybe you can speak to that for a second, but also in association, when you think about streaming services, right now their sole revenue is subscription, But as they start to introduce advertising, which a lot of services are talking about, and if you don't want to see ads, you have to pay a premium. Can you talk about the again, it's sort of the historicals about how license fees are set if you're if you're one of the cable companies, your A&E or whatever it is, or a network, how those fees were set as compared to how they're set now with streaming services, and how the streaming services income may change over time.
Yeah, no, sure, Joel, because it's important, for people to know the history of how these deals have been structured, traditional media, and now the audio or audiovisual streaming area. Many of the deals are based on past deals have been. I'm talking about traditional media primarily, local TV, network TV, all the cable situations. They're based on a percentage of gross revenue, sometimes a percentage of advertising gross receipts. Certain of the big ones are flat dollar amounts where they're just negotiate. I'll just throw an example. I would say $10 million for a particular service or entity, just a flat dollar amount on it. There's also non-revenue-based fees where they've been negotiated with an industry group who negotiates, let's say, for all of the cable industry or all the local TV industry. So that's a factor in these things. You've got, I think, Turner was a good example. Turner Broadcasting, where there was the initial deal was it was various percentages of revenue. The high one was based on music intensive shows. There was a lesser percentage on just general entertainment shows. And then for news and talk radio or talk shows, you had a lesser percentage of gross revenue. So the deals are all negotiated. The only times they're not negotiated is when with ASCAP and BMI, they're under consent decrees with the government, and if the user in ASCAP or BMI cannot come to an agreement as to what a reasonable fee is for that particular media, it goes to court, Southern District in New York, and a judge actually makes a ruling as to what the fee should be after a trial. CSAC has a mandatory arbitration for local TV and local radio, so there are some restrictions on these if you can't make a negotiated deal and stuff. But that's basically set up. One last thing, many of the audio visual streaming deals are under NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. So I throw out all this information about different types of other types of deals, because even if there's a lot of the current deals, there's no public knowledge as to what the deals are with the PROs, that at least you know how these deals are set up in the traditional media, and they do factor into how these type of structured deals are actually created. And obviously they're under NDA, so I can't discuss anything about that. Knowing the history of the type of deals, it gives you a good example of where you might be. Advertising is a major part of a lot of the deals. So to me, that was very positive with a lot of the audiovisual streaming services now thinking of putting advertising as one aspect of their operations.
To your point, and please tell me if I've got this right, Todd, the idea historically is, as our licensees, the people who essentially are customers, A&E, Netflix, as they make more money, composers make more money. That's the idea, that just as when cable began, which you spoke about before, the deals were very small because cable wasn't making money. But then as they were making more and more money, composers benefited from that as well. It's easy to think about a Netflix and how big it is. I think they, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they create something crazy like, I think they actually have a production budget of $8 billion a year, which is more than the next three competitors combined.
But they're catching up, though, the other ones.
That's true. That's true. Well, Disney says they are, but there may be some hazy math. But I think at the end of the day, what these companies are saying, which is I think is arguably true, is that despite the fact that they've got all this market share, that they're not making a ton of money yet. But again, as you said, as advertising comes in, or you want to go out without advertising, you pay an extra fee. All these things benefit composers over time. So I think it's important to understand that for composers who choose the buyout up front, they're not only giving away the dollars necessarily that they might be earning today, but the next day or the next day or the next day or the next day. So to your point, it's just important that if you choose to go that route, and again, everyone has a choice, is to just recognize what potentially you may be missing out on upfront or over time, I should say. The other thing that's kind of odd, and maybe you can speak about this, Todd, but when every time a composer does a buyout, that essentially in the negotiations with the licensee, it makes the catalog of each of the PROs less valuable, right? So that if you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe you can put more precision on this, but uh, these dollars that are taken out of the system per se through buyouts, they will affect composers or the value of composers' music more and more over time. So it's important also to think about not only your short-term benefit, but your long-term benefit and the long-term benefit of all the other people in the industry. Am I overstating it? Is there a better way to say it?
No, no, Joel, you're saying it exactly like it is. I'll give you a good example. You mentioned the cable situation. Cable at one time, let's see, back in, I think in 1995, $60 million came into the US PROs, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC in those days. $60 million in 95. ASCAP and I think $250 million was coming in from the networks and from local TV. Big difference. In 2000, ASCAP, particularly and MBMI, had litigation against in the cable industry. There were settlements and stuff. It all of a sudden went up to about $225 million coming in. In 2012, it was up to $400 million for all cable revenue coming into the PROs. Now it's well over $600 million. So, cable all of a sudden was the minor source of revenue for composers. Network and local TV were the big ones. It completely reversed over time. And primarily it was because of what ASCAP and BMI, had as far as repertory. When they went into a negotiate with the cable industry, cable industry says, well, what do you have as far as repertory? What are we buying from you? And ASCAP and BMI had significant repertory, very big composers. Almost all the shows were theirs, and they negotiated higher fees. Once you start removing repertory out of these PROs, obviously it's going to affect the next negotiation. So, give you an example. If you had a negotiation with an audiovisual streaming service, or even with a network, ABC network, for example, and all of a sudden you had 25% of the shows on that were all buyouts or direct licenses. That reduces ASCAP or BMI's bargaining power to negotiate a higher license fee. In effect, they'd be negotiating most likely a lower license fee. So anytime, it's just some fact of life. If you do buyouts or direct licenses, particularly buyouts, 100% buyouts with no back end, I mean, it takes the shows or the creative product out of the PROs. This is worldwide also. And it reduces their bargaining position for future negotiations for all composers, songwriters,
Yeah.
and music. So it's a very good point, Joel, but
Yeah.
you are right on that.
I think it may be useful for anybody in the audience here who has not checked out the webinar we did with Carter Burwell, who, legendary composer Carter Burwell, who first of all has an amazing career, but also is so well spoken, way smarter than I am. He pointed out a few things because I think a lot of young composers or first time composers say, look, I'm negotiating with Netflix. How am I going to say no to Netflix? And what's in terms of buyouts? And what's really interesting is that Netflix and some of the other streaming services have actually said in public that, well, if somebody doesn't want the buyout deal, which a lot of times is multiples of, let's say you would earn $1 in production, maybe you earn $3 or $4 in production. But in the media, they have said, look, you can turn down the buyout and you can go through the normal PR system. So if in a negotiation with any of these services, you're hearing something different, check the press, and I think you'll find that these public statements are out there, and you can point to them and just ask if their policy has changed. So the second thing that Carter talked about in this, and I don't want to tell you the whole webinar because I don't want to impinge certainly on Todd's time here, but just to connect it to what we're talking about, that gee, I don't have an attorney. I can't afford an attorney. This is my very first show. I don't know where to start. And what Carter said is, look, first of all, these organizations like Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, and maybe Todd, you can speak about these organizations, uh, who will, based on need, help composers negotiate their first contract. There are also, basically, Carter said, if you have a friend of a friend who is an attorney, or you know somebody who's a composer, very rarely will somebody say, no, I'm not going to help you. So I think if you think just a little bit, if you sort of explore a little bit through your list of contacts, you're likely to find somebody who at least give you a little bit of information to get you started. But Todd, maybe you can speak briefly about, some of these legal services that are available to help composers out, and songwriters for that matter, and also video game composers when they're doing contracts. Where are the places to start for these young composers who may not have had any experience with contracts at all?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, one of the things is the starting point for me always is uh, I'll take our book for example. It's like 656 pages. There are huge chapters on television and on film and TV and video game scoring contracts, going through in detail what the provisions are, what the standards are, where you can go wrong, but just as a starting point. I mean, you have to have some kind of knowledge. Then you have organizations. Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts are very good. There are a lot of lawyers out there. You go to the local bar association, they'll have referrals for lawyers. In most cases, these type of I mean, I've dealt with composing contract film. TV ones are easier. The film ones can be extensive when you're dealing with a major composer. But most structure deals are very basic, and they're in our book, and there are other sources where you can get them. So, as a starting point, but there are a lot of organizations out there. You just have to go look, and getting friends who are in the business or have any type of knowledge. In my whole career, all the composers I've known, they've always been willing to share their contracts with me. Obviously, I don't spread them around, and sometimes we'll leave the dollar figures off. But the basic structure of these deals, as you full well know, Joe, are pretty much the same, whether it's television, video game contracts. Initially were not good for composers going back to the start of the video game area. Then the bigger agents, I like to call them Hollywood agents, got involved with the bigger composers doing video games. Now the video game contracts look very similar to film contracts, which is really positive, where there are back end royalties which are shared, it's a learning process, but
Yeah.
it starts someplace.
So anyway, I was trying to give you a little layup for your book, Todd, but you're probably just way too modest to talk about it. I will tell you that when I first started my career, Todd's book was right at the top of my list. And to be honest, 600 and some odd pages was a little bit overwhelming for me. But what I learned through a couple of friends is take 2 pages a night. Focus on an area that may be really important to you around, specifically around contracts. You don't have to sit and read a book like Todd's front to back exhaustively to be able to get a tremendous amount out of it. Just 2 pages a day. You'll learn a little more, and a little more, and a little more. Don't tell me you don't have time for 2 pages a day. Uh,
Hey, mention one thing on that, because the good thing about our book, it does give dollar figures in there, and it's broken up into chapters. So I was talking to some composers last week and stuff, where there's a Broadway show coming up based on a particular movie, which is not uncommon these days. And I said, okay, go and read our Broadway chapter, and you can see exactly the type of money you can make, what the deal structures are. So the book really sets out all these different fields where, if you are a composer or a songwriter, and you're faced with another opportunity, which happens all the time these days, because you can have a movie that becomes a Broadway show, which becomes a TV series, which becomes a video game, all of them different media, different types of contracts, but there's a similarity between all of them. So again, it's knowledge is everything. One last thing, because as you know, Joel, I've taught at USC with my brother for 21 years now. It's music publishing and music licensing, but part of the course is film, TV, and video game scoring contracts and writing original songs for those media. So it's something that you have to know. It's basic. You can get the basic structure of it, and then you negotiate around that structure. But you've got to know the structure.
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, you threw a bunch of great points in there, Todd. I just want to go
Too
back and
many.
just to go back and pick up a few of them. Uh, I think probably most of the supporters of Your Music, Your Future, who are composers, which by the way is for composers by composers. We are a not-for-profit. It's really, we have one goal, which is education, to help composers and songwriters and game composers understand some of the basics. So here's what, in general, that we've learned, which is learn a little bit of information, learn a little bit more from that. As you need it, continue to learn a little bit more and more. What Carter had said, and I think Todd just referred to as well, is as composers, we can't expect that people who represent us, whether it's an attorney, whether it's a manager, whether it's an agent when you get far enough in your career, we can't just write music all the time and completely ignore the business side and expect that somebody else will take care of it. We are business people, after all. We all got into this not to read contracts, uh, but just to write music and spend our entire lives learning how to write music and learning how to write music specifically, score for all these different media, which, as we know, is a an incredibly intensive and time intensive process, an experience intensive process. But just knowing a little bit, again, as Todd was saying, specifically certain areas that you may be coming in contact with is absolutely vital. And again, Carter mentioned this um, in his uh, webinar as well. So I do want to wrap up with a question, Todd, maybe you can help us out with, and then I wanted to just give a couple of quick closing remarks. So I think that it would be really helpful for composers to understand from your perspective, where are we going in the industry from the standpoint of, do you continue to expect to see the value of music go up? Have we plateaued? Where do you see, the value of copyrights? There's a lot of copyrights that are being sold now. I know this is a very expansive topic, but maybe you can just kind of give us a little bit of a crystal ball of what you see might be happening in terms of music value over the next number of years.
Yeah. Well, the music values, if you read the headlines. I've been involved in some of those deals, and you read the headlines, and the copyright, the value of copyrights have risen significantly. I mean, the multiples that people are paying for these catalogs, and they're mainly radio catalogs up until this point and stuff like that. But you need things that are sustainable. That's one of the big things when you're evaluating these copyrights. And in our book, we have a whole chapter on buying and selling copyrights, so I refer that to you on it. But to me, the film and TV area, it's product that is essential 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years from now. It's going to be continually performed because the media outlets have expanded so much, not only in the United States, but throughout the entire world. So the need for product is immense, and that's not going away. And based on the need, that really affects the value. And obviously, you have to have something that's people want to see or want to view or anything else and stuff in the audio visual area. But to me, I'm very bullish on the values in the future and stuff like that, because media is not going away, and it's only going to expand. And the type of other types of income that can come from a particular one creation, it can make money in so many different ways these days, outside of just the audio area. So
in video composing, as we've discussed before, there's a lot of now symphony orchestras locally who are playing this music, and there may be licensing fees that a composer can be part of, or certainly performance royalties and other kinds of avenues for income. One of the things we talk about all the time in Your Music, Your Future is it's not like the past. It used to be you were a composer, period of end of story, period end of story. You were a songwriter, period end of story. You were a video composer. I think what we find with most of our supporters is everyone is involved in multiple different aspects of the business, partly because everyone is so talented. And I think to Todd's point, and again, different chapters in his book will help you understand how to earn money in each of those cases. Just to wrap things up quickly, I think it's really important for as composers to realize that what we create is enormously valuable. That the relationships we have with the creative minds and writers and directors that we work with, they know how valuable our work is. They a lot of times will be the ones who go to bat for us in negotiations that might happen. You say, "Hey, I'm stuck. Can you help me out?" Um, and I think it's really important to remember there is no Netflix without us. There is no Disney Plus without us. That the work that we create is part and parcel of all of the audiovisual medium, all of the films, all of the television shows, all of the specials, all of the video games. None of this would be as compelling or as powerful without the work that we do. So it's incredibly important for all of us to hold that value and recognize that having the choice about how you're compensated, having the choice of collecting performance royalties is something you've earned through a lifetime of work and value that you've created through your work for different television shows and films. So, if anything else, I just want to make sure Todd has at length talked about this value, talked about the financial components about this, talked about what you need to know to be able to earn a living as a composer or a songwriter or a video game composer. There's always more to learn. But again, if we remember nothing else, it's that the work we create is incredibly valuable, and we need to stand up for that value, or no one else will. So, Todd Brabec, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I could talk to you for more hours, and hopefully, we'll be able to drag you back in for a future episode. But thank you so much for your expertise and everything you've offered to Your Music, Your Future, and the community at large over your entire career.
So thank you, Joe. And I tell you, what you've done and all the composers who have joined your efforts for you with Your Music, Your Future, I think is extraordinary. So it's absolutely essential these days when composers have to realize what their value is, and their value is extraordinary and enormous, not only in the United States but throughout the world. So thanks, Joe, to you and everybody.
Thanks so much, Todd. Again, Your Music, Your Future. My name is Joel Beckerman, and I hope you'll come check out the rest of the webinars, and there'll be more coming up. So thanks again, and go make some awesome music, will you? Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.